Welcome for another episode of our interview series where we're attempting to talk to lawyers, professors, thought leaders, reporters, and anybody who's studied the subject and has an intelligent perspective to give from any particular vantage point. This is our National Divorce Interview series. Well, today we were able to get one question with Professor Daniel Klein. Professor Klein asked that we ask Professor Donald Livingston about the question that we asked Professor Klein. So I'm going to show you all of that. Let's get right to it. Okay, so our show today is One Question with Professor Daniel Klein. He is a thinker for the Cato Institute, the Independent Institute. He teaches economics at George Mason University, and he's also part of the American Institute for Economic Research. Now, originally we had approached Professor Klein about the economics of a potential independent red state. You know, if the red states broke off and left, what economic options would they have for the future, or does it mean automatic poverty? And we weren't able to get him to do that, but we were able to get a question about the legality of secession with Professor Daniel Klein from George Mason University. Question for Professor Livingston: do you agree with Professor Klein? And this is what we asked Professor Donald Livingston in another interview that we did yesterday. And we're taking some of Donald Livingston's answers and providing them now when we do a response to Professor Klein. So on April 4th, around 6:17 p.m., Professor Klein wrote, and his email's been stripped from this: I'm not prepared to talk about the red state nation in an economic capacity. That was what I originally asked it for. My main thought is, however desirable independence or secession may be, it is not something that opponents would ever permit, no more than Lincoln permitted secession. I responded to Professor Klein the next day in the evening by saying, but Lincoln did permit secession. He permitted secession by consent of those who signed the contract. He only disavowed unilateral secession. He said in his inaugural address that if Southern states approached Congress and there was a vote of the people, he would have to abide. Lincoln also personally appointed Salmon Chase as the top Supreme Court justice, personally. And Salmon Chase said in the Supreme Court decision, Texas versus White, that states could not unilaterally secede, but they could secede with consent of the states. So I said to the professor, Daniel Klein, directly, if red states approach Congress and ask for a vote and a majority of Congress approved, could those red states then secede? Given this meets the conditions by President Lincoln and Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase. Professor Klein had this response the same day, but later in the day. Well, Lincoln would have known the out that he permitted, about which I do not know anything more about than you're right, wouldn't actually be feasible. So Professor Klein is saying that this out for secession that Lincoln permitted, that I'm claiming, wouldn't actually be feasible, right? Then there is a question of whether it is constitutional or natural law. Lincoln's requirement, as you described it, was valid or just. I just don't know a lot, but my indication is against see this book. Donald Livingston knows of this work. As for secession effort might work and how its opponents would respond exactly, I am not at all up to on any of that, but I just feel in my gut that opponents would put a stop to it one way or another. Well, I agree with the professor that opponents will attempt to stop secession. Absolutely. The people in power don't want this. I have talked to a couple other professors in this debate series and asked them, why did so many people on the left and the right, the day after Marjorie Taylor Greene said, hey, let's have a national divorce on President's Day, talk about how there's no political division in America? How did people on the left and on the right go to the news and the day after Marjorie Taylor Greene says, let's have a national divorce, purport that there's no division in America, there never has been, and she's just making it? And then I would show all these national news stories going back 5 to 10 years that it showed that there was massive national division. And yet somehow the media on the left and the right didn't mention or cover any of that at all. So I absolutely agree with Professor Klein that the opponents or the system won't like this and they'll try to do that, stop it, because they absolutely have done that. MSNBC, and then you saw Jack Probasek, who's a conservative, reference MSNBC, and he's alt-right. It was truly bizarre. People on the alt-left and alt-right were both saying the exact same talking points within 24 hours of Marjorie Taylor Greene's speech, almost like they coordinated with each other when they absolutely are supposed to not talk with each other at all. It's quite bizarre. But they had the same talking points. There's basically almost nobody in the mainstream news who said, hey, this is a good idea. So absolutely, everybody in the media on the left and the right completely moved in lockstep. However, the question is Lincoln's out that he permitted in his inauguration address, would that be feasible? And is it constitutional or natural law? And then he references his book and says, my inclination would be that it would not be. And then he cites this book. So we took it from there. We tracked down the book, Chaining Down Leviathan, The American Dream of Self-Government, 1776 to 1865. As a distinguished historian of political thought at the University of Milan, Italy, Professor Marco Bassani brings a cosmopolitan perspective to the study of American political thought, unencumbered by such self-congratulatory myths as American exceptionalism. That was not the case with the American founding. Whereas Europeans were burdened with heavy taxation and stood in fear of large standing armies, Americans after 1800 paid no inland federal taxes, and by 1835 the national government was out of debt. By 1860 the national government had actually diminished in power to tax spend and incur debt from what it could do in 1790, while the central government in modern European states grew continuously during that period. Yet Americans fought two major wars, built the Industrial Revolution, and more than tripled its territorial size. Bassani explains how the Constitution made this possible, and how it was derailed by Lincoln's decision to invade and conquer 11 states that had lawfully voted to secede rather than negotiate a separation. That's exactly what we said. So that last sentence, Bassani explains how the Constitution made this possible and how it was derailed by Lincoln's decision to invade and conquer 11 states that had lawfully voted to secede rather than negotiate a separation. So Professor Klein is looking at this book and going, well, Lincoln shut down these states leaving. And this book says, I guess they legally could leave, but they were shut down anyways. And that backs up the professor's point. But it also backs up my point. Bassani explains how the Constitution made this possible and how it was derailed by Lincoln's decision to invade and conquer 11 states that had lawfully voted to secede rather than negotiate a separation. Actually, what Abraham Lincoln said in his inauguration address was that they would have to negotiate a separation through a vote or will of the people. He didn't say you could just have a vote on your own and go. Lincoln specifically said in his inaugural address that the parties to the contract, if someone's going to leave, you would still have to consult the original parties who signed the contract about if you wanted to leave the contract. That's basic contract law. So if these states join America and one state says they want to leave, why should they be able to leave on their own when they sign a contract with everybody? Shouldn't everybody, or at least the majority of the people in those contracts, also be able to say, since we permitted you into this union, we can permit you to leave out? That was Lincoln's thing. And it meant that you could have a negotiated separation that we allow for legal secession. So I asked Professor Donald Livingston these questions. Do you agree with Professor Klein? Secession's not permitted. It's not legal. And I said, here's this book. And it says they didn't negotiate a settlement. They had a vote and that didn't work. So is secession legal or not legal through Texas versus White, built on Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address? Then we covered Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. And I walked Professor Livingston through every single part of Lincoln's inaugural address where he said a negotiated settlement by the contract people who signed the contract would be a legal way to secede. And I also explained how this is backed up by Texas versus White, which said you could secede with consent to the states. So Lincoln's inaugural address says you can secede with consent of all or a majority of the contract signatories. Texas versus White, decided by a guy Lincoln personally appointed, also said you could secede through reform of consent of the states. They're referring to the same thing. So after I walked Professor Livingston through Lincoln's inaugural address, I asked him straight up, did Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address allow for secession? Is this related to Texas versus White? Does Texas versus White allow for secession? And Professor Livingston agreed with me that yes, it does. So kind of a mixed conversation. Professor Klein was absolutely correct that there's going to be people in the system who are going to try to shut this down. We have seen the system not allowing fair conversation of this. I have discussed that with many professors, and many of them have acknowledged that the media is not giving a fair representation of the facts on the ground. They're just trying to tell people to not have this conversation. So many of the other professors we've interviewed absolutely back up Professor Klein's assertion about how the system will react. However, when we get to the specific details on the legality of secession, it appears there's some confusion. I cleared that up with Professor Donald Livingston, and he said for a fact, you can secede. It is allowable under Texas versus White. Texas versus White says you can secede with consent. It was decided by Solomon Chase. Solomon Chase was appointed by Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln did have an inaugural address, and in the inaugural address, he does say there's a way to get out of the Union legally through consent. So that was an interesting conversation we had with Professor Daniel Klein and Professor Donald Livingston. Daniel Klein, thank you so much. He referenced that we asked this question of Donald Livingston, and we did exactly what he asked us to do. And we were able to get a more in-depth understanding. You know, the system is against secession, but there is a legal path allowed. And it was allowed by Abraham Lincoln. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for participating and watching our conversations. We'll have even more interviews coming up soon. Please like and subscribe. And we'll see you soon. Let me check out the comment. Yep, Lincoln is totally fine with secession. And you're right, the Soviet Union voted themselves out of existence. Same can be done with the USA. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, James. You guys are both right. Violent secession is bad and wrong. Unilateral secession is bad and wrong. A negotiated settlement is democracy. We'll leave it there. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you soon.